The banishment. The sky above the stone arena burned with the color of dying embers, and the crowd that gathered was restless, their faces full of disgust. In this world, nothing was considered more sacred than the ability to bear children, and nothing was hated more than the failure of that ability. The young woman stood in the middle of the circle, her wrists bound with metal cuffs, her eyes lowered as the voices of her people rose like waves crashing against a cliff. She had no name here anymore, not since the moment the elders declared her barren. She was only a failure, a burden, a reminder of weakness in a society that worshipped strength and fertility. The elders did not waste words on her. They read her sentence in sharp voices and declared her unfit to remain among them. According to their law, anyone who could not give life was no better than the dead, and the dead belonged outside the city walls, left for the harsh wasteland to consume. Her chest tightened as she felt the rough grip of the guards on her arms, dragging her toward the gates. She heard laughter from the crowd, mocking her cries, and she bit down on her tongue to stop the sound of fear from escaping. They wanted her to weep and beg, but she refused to give them that satisfaction. The gates opened with a heavy groan, revealing the desert beyond. It stretched endlessly, a sea of cracked earth and shattered stone, where the sun was merciless and the nights carried cold that cut deeper than steel. No one survived out there, at least not for long. She knew that was the point. This was not exile. This was execution, dressed in another name. The guards shoved her forward, and the gates closed behind her with a final echo. She stood still for a long moment, her body trembling, until the sound of the locked ceiling reminded her that she no longer belonged to the world inside those walls. She was condemned, unwanted, abandoned. The first hours in the wasteland were torture. The heat pressed against her skin, turning her lips dry and her throat to fire. She walked because stopping meant death, but every step felt heavier than the last. Her mind replayed the moment when the elders had looked at her with cold eyes, as if she were already gone. She wondered if they would even remember her tomorrow, or if her existence would vanish like dust in the wind. Her heart ached with a hollow emptiness. All her life she had tried to be enough, to belong, to serve her people faithfully. But one truth had erased everything. Her inability to give life had made her less than human in their eyes. As the sun fell and shadows stretched across the desert, the cold crept in. She wrapped her thin arms around herself, shaking, her body too weak to continue. She collapsed near a pile of broken stones, curling into a ball, half wishing that the end would come quickly. But as her eyes closed, she thought she heard something strange, footsteps that did not belong to the desert. She forced herself to open her eyes, and in the dim light, she saw a figure moving slowly toward her. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in worn cloth, the figure carried something glowing faintly. She blinked, unsure if it was real or a trick of her fading mind. The figure knelt beside her and offered a container of water. His face was unlike any she had ever seen, softer, with features not of her people. His eyes carried weariness but also a warmth she could not understand. He spoke in a voice she did not know, yet his tone was gentle. She hesitated, staring at the water. It could be poison, it could be another cruel trick, but her body betrayed her fear. She reached out, trembling, and drank. The water burned down her throat but also gave her strength she thought she had already lost. The stranger studied her with quiet patience. He did not mock her, did not scorn her, did not look at her with the judgment that had chased her all her life. Instead, he seemed to recognize her suffering as if he carried his own scars. He extended his hand, urging her to stand. Her legs trembled, but with his help she rose. She looked into his eyes and felt something she had never felt before. Not pity, not cruelty, but something closer to respect. He led her through the ruins hidden beyond the stones, a place she had not noticed before. The shadows swallowed them, hiding them from the open desert. She followed him with hesitation, her mind filled with questions. Who was he? Why was he here in a land no one could survive? What did he want from her? She clutched the ragged cloth around her shoulders and stayed close, too weak to argue, too desperate to turn away from the only hand that had been stretched out to her since her exile. When they reached the shelter, she saw it was little more than a hollow carved into stone, yet it was warm, and there was a small fire glowing inside. A child sat near the flames, her eyes wide with innocence. She looked up at the woman without fear, only curiosity, and offered a small piece of food in her tiny hands. The woman's chest tightened. Even in her own world, children had been kept from her, as though she carried a curse. Yet here was a child freely giving her something she could not provide for herself. She sank to the ground near the fire, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind spinning. She was alive when she should have been dead, inside a shelter she could not have found on her own, beside beings she had never known existed. The man and his daughter spoke quietly in their strange language, but their eyes said more than words. They were not her people, yet they treated her as though she still had worth. As sleep pulled at her, she realized that her story was no longer in the hands of the elders who had cast her out. Something had changed the moment the stranger offered her water. She did not know if he was her salvation or another trial, but deep inside, a spark of hope flickered where before there had only been despair. For the first time since her condemnation, she wondered if perhaps her life was not over. A fragile shelter, the woman woke slowly, her body wrapped in warmth she had not felt in many days. For a moment she thought it was a dream, a cruel trick of her weary mind. But as her eyes opened, she saw the soft flicker of firelight dancing across the rough stone walls. She was lying on a thin blanket spread across the floor, her head resting on a folded cloth that served as a pillow. The air smelled of smoke and something warm, perhaps food, though faint and simple. She sat up carefully, her muscles aching, and her eyes fell on the figure sitting near the fire. It was the man she had seen in the desert, the stranger who had given her water. His face looked tired, his hands scarred, but there was a quiet strength in the way he sat, watching the flames as though guarding them from the darkness beyond. Beside him, the child stirred. She must have been no more than 6 or 7, small and thin, with hair falling loosely across her face. The child's eyes found the woman almost immediately, and instead of fear or mistrust, they lit up with curiosity and something close to joy. She carried a piece of bread, walked over with her tiny feet pattering softly against the stone floor, and placed the bread into the woman's hands. The woman hesitated. In her old life, she had been avoided by children, never trusted with. Their presence always reminded that she could never be a mother. Yet here was this small human, offering her food without hesitation. Her throat tightened as she whispered a thank you, though she did not know if the child understood her words. The man watched quietly. His language was different from hers, but his eyes carried, meaning that words could not. He gestured for her to eat, and she obeyed, tearing the bread slowly, letting its taste fill her mouth. It was rough and plain, but it gave her strength, and more importantly, it gave her a sense of belonging she had never felt before. She wondered who he was, why he lived here, hidden in this wasteland where no one was meant to survive. Her people had told stories of humans, creatures from another world, stubborn and defiant, a race that had been almost destroyed in wars long past. To see one alive here was strange enough, but to see him caring for a child alone in such a cruel place was something she could not understand. Over the next days she began to see more of his life. His shelter was small, carved into the side of the ruined stone structures that dotted the wasteland, perhaps remains of an ancient city forgotten by both humans and her own kind. He had built what little he had with his own hands, shaping wood and stone into tools, weaving cloth from scraps, always working to protect the child. She noticed the way he always gave the girl food first, saving the smallest portions for himself, even if it left him hungry. She noticed the way he kept watch at night, barely sleeping, his ears alert for the sound of danger. He was alone carrying the burden of both father and protector, and yet he never showed the child his fear or his weariness. The woman tried to help, though her body was still weak. She gathered stones for the fire, carried water in broken containers, and cleaned the space as best she could. At first the man watched her with caution, as though unsure if she was trustworthy, but slowly he seemed to accept her presence. The child accepted her even faster. She would sit beside the woman, pointing at objects, laughing softly, teaching her small words in the human tongue. The woman began to repeat them, her voice rough but growing steadier each time. It felt strange to learn a new language, to see the child's smile brighten when she spoke a word correctly, but it gave her purpose, something her old world had stolen from her. Still, her heart carried a heavy shadow. She could not forget the reason she was here, the shame her people had poured upon her, the cruel word barren echoing in her mind. Even when the human father looked at her with quiet respect, she wondered how long it would last. Would he cast her aside when she was strong enough to survive on her own, or would he come to see her as useless, just as her people had? At night, when the fire dimmed and silence pressed in, she lay awake, battling the fear that she was nothing more than a burden in this fragile place. One evening, as the sun dipped beyond the horizon, she stepped outside the shelter. The desert spread endlessly before her, its colors turning to shades of blue and silver under the moon. She felt the weight of exile pressing on her shoulders, but then she heard footsteps behind her. The man had followed, his child asleep inside. He stood beside her in silence, both of them looking out at the vast emptiness. After a long moment, he spoke in his language, words she did not fully understand, yet his tone was gentle. He pointed at the stars above, his hand tracing patterns, as though telling a story written across the sky. She watched his face in the moonlight, saw the sorrow in his eyes when he mentioned a word that sounded like loss. She did not need to know his tongue to understand. He had lost someone, perhaps the child's mother, perhaps more. He carried grief just as heavy as hers. That night something shifted between them. She no longer saw him only as a stranger who had saved her life. She saw him as a father carrying a burden that might one day break him, yet he never allowed it to touch the child. And he in turn seemed to see her not as a broken exile, but as someone who could share the weight of survival. Their trust was fragile, built not on promises but on the small moments of kindness that passed between them. But peace in the wasteland was never safe for long. A low hum began to fill the air one morning, a sound that made her heart freeze. She knew it well, the patrols of her people, scanning the deserts for survivors, for anyone who dared live outside the city's cruel laws. She ran to the entrance of the shelter, her eyes wide as the shadow of a ship swept across the ground. The man heard it too. His body stiffened, his hands reaching for the crude weapon he kept near the fire. The child clung to his leg, sensing danger in the air. The woman's heart pounded as she realized the truth. If the patrol found them, they would kill the man and the child without hesitation. And her people would drag her back not to forgive her, but to make an example of her betrayal. She stood frozen, caught between the world that had cast her out and the fragile shelter she had found here. For the first time since her banishment, she felt something she had not expected, fear not for herself, but for the man and the child who had given her a place when she had nothing. The hum grew louder, the ship lowering somewhere close by, and the sound of footsteps in the sand began to echo across the ruins. The fragile shelter she had come to know as safety was now under threat, and she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Suspicion and trust, the hum of the patrol ship faded into a deep vibration that, seemed to shake the stones of the ruins, and the woman's heart beat faster with every passing second. She knew that sound too well, for it had been the same kind of ship that had carried her to the gates of her city before casting her into exile. The patrol was close, and if they searched carefully, there would be no way to hide. The man stood at the entrance of the shelter, his hand tight around the handle of a crude blade, his eyes steady and alert, though the lines on his face showed the weight of fear he tried to keep hidden. The child pressed against him, her small fingers clutching the fabric of his clothes as though he could protect her from anything. Woman felt torn between two worlds. The people outside were her kind, and yet they had abandoned her with cruelty. They had declared her barren and worthless, and now they returned as hunters searching for what they feared or despised. Inside this fragile shelter was a human man and his child, strangers who had shown her kindness without asking anything in return, strangers who saw her as more than a failure. She could not decide if she belonged to either world or if she belonged nowhere at all. The man motioned for her to stay back. He spoke quickly in his language, and though she did not understand every word, his meaning was clear. Stay hidden, keep the child safe. She watched him step out into the night, his figure swallowed by the darkness around the ruins. For a long moment she sat frozen, her ears straining to catch any sound outside, but only the low thrum of the ship filled the air. Then came voices, sharp and commanding voices that belonged to soldiers. She crept toward the entrance and peered through a crack in the stone there. In the dim light of the moons, she saw 3 figures in armor, searching the ground with scanning devices. The patrol ship loomed behind them, its lights sweeping across the desert like the eyes of some great beast. The man stood still, his weapon lowered, but his body tense as though ready to strike at any moment. One of the soldiers spoke to him, harshly demanding to know what he was doing in the wasteland. The man answered slowly, his words measured and calm, though the woman could hear the edge of defiance in his tone. She felt a strange pull in her chest watching him stand alone against them. He did not beg, he did not cower, he faced them with the same strength she had seen in his eyes when he gave her water. The soldiers were not satisfied. They spread out, moving closer to the ruins where the shelter was hidden. One of them glanced toward the crack where she hid, and her breath caught in her throat. She pressed the child close to her chest, praying the soldier would not look deeper. The little one trembled, but did not cry, as though she too understood the danger. A long moment passed, and then the soldier turned away, continuing his search. The woman exhaled slowly, her hands shaking. She knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered the truth. When the soldiers questioned the man again, he raised his weapon and his stance hardened. Soldiers laughed at his defiance, mocking the weakness of a single human standing against them. They lifted their rifles, and for a heartbeat, she thought they would kill him where he stood. Something inside her snapped at the thought of losing him and leaving the child fatherless. She rose from her hiding place and stepped out into the open. The soldiers froze as they saw her. One of them shouted her name, though it was no longer her name but the curse of barren woman. They recognized her immediately, and their voices filled the night with scorn. They told her she had been condemned and had no right to live among the living. They ordered her to return with them, promising she would be judged more kindly if she obeyed. She stood trembling, her eyes darting between the man who had saved her and the soldiers who had cast her out. The choice tore at her heart. She could return to her people and perhaps be allowed to live, though in chains and shame, or she could stay with the human who had given her shelter, but in doing so mark herself a traitor forever. The soldiers demanded again, their voices sharp and commanding. She closed her eyes and remembered the night. She had been pushed through the gates, remembered the laughter and the jeers, remembered the cold desert swallowing her whole. She opened her eyes and met the gaze of the man. He did not speak, but in his eyes she saw something that gave her strength. Not pity, not fear, but trust. She turned to the soldiers, and for the first time in her life, she did not bow her head. She spoke with a steady voice, declaring that she would not return with them. They laughed again, their hands tightening on their weapons, calling her Foolish, but she stood firm. Her body trembled, but she did not step back. Instead, she moved closer to the man and raised her chin as though daring them to strike her down. The soldiers exchanged glances, their faces twisting with anger. One of them stepped forward, raising his rifle. The man moved instantly, his blade flashing in the moonlight. He struck with fierce speed, forcing the soldier back. The fight erupted, suddenly loud and violent in the still night. The woman ducked as fire burst from the rifle, striking the stones around them. She grabbed a loose piece of metal and swung it with desperate strength, knocking one soldier to the ground. The man fought with brutal determination, his movements fast and precise. Though the soldiers outnumbered him, the child cried out from within the shelter, and the sound filled the woman with new strength. She struck again, using every ounce of her rage, every wound her people had left upon her soul, until the soldier before her lay still. The man drove back the last of them, his blade dripping with effort and blood. The surviving soldier staggered back toward the ship, shouting for retreat. The engines roared, and the ship lifted into the sky, leaving them in silence once more. Woman stood gasping, her hands shaking, the metal weapon falling from her grip. She turned to the man, his body bruised, his breath heavy. He nodded at her, not with surprise, but with respect, as though her choice had been the only one that mattered. The child ran to them and clung to both her father and the woman, her small arms wrapping around them with trembling relief. In that moment, the woman knew she had made her decision. She no longer belonged to the world that had cast her out. She belonged here in this fragile shelter with the human who had trusted her, and the child who had seen her not as barren, not as broken, but as family. But as the fires of battle dimmed, she also knew that the patrol would return. They had seen her, they had seen the man and his child. They would not forget, and they would not forgive. The fragile peace had been shattered, and the days ahead would bring even greater trials, betrayal or redemption. The ruins lay quiet after the clash, yet the silence carried no peace, for both the man and the woman knew that the danger was far from over. The patrol had retreated, but they had not been defeated, and soldiers never forgot a fight. They would return in greater numbers, and when they did, there would be no mercy. The man sat against the stone wall, breathing heavily, his blade resting beside him, his clothes torn and stained with blood. The child clung to him, her small face pressed against his chest, whispering soft, frightened sounds, as if afraid that even her voice might call the soldiers back. The woman knelt beside them, her hands trembling as she tried to bind the wounds across his arm with a strip of cloth. She did not speak, but her eyes told the story of fear and guilt that burned inside her. As she worked, her mind turned over the words the soldiers had thrown at her. They had called her back, promising pardon if she returned, promising life in chains instead of death in the wasteland. The thought clawed at her. She had chosen to stand with the man, but what if it had been a mistake? What if she had doomed them all by refusing? What if her loyalty to the only people she had ever known could still save her? There was a small voice inside her whispering that she had been born of them, shaped by their laws, and though they had cast her out, she still belonged to them. She hated the voice, but it was there, gnawing at her with every heartbeat. The man must have seen the shadow in her eyes, for when she finally looked at him, he spoke. In his steady voice, though his words were not ones she could understand, his tone, however, was clear. He trusted her. His eyes did not hold suspicion or anger. They held something heavier and more dangerous. He believed in her choice. She felt her chest tighten with the weight of it, because she knew trust was harder to carry than chains. She could betray him and live, yet in betraying him, she would lose something far greater than life itself. Past and the desert seemed quieter than usual, but the woman felt the tension in the air, as though the sands themselves held their breath. She helped the man recover, moving carefully so his wounds could heal. She cared for the child who clung to her as if she were already part of the family. She began to feel the warmth of belonging, something she had never been allowed to hold before. But the fear never left her. It grew larger each night when she lay awake listening for the sound of engines in the sky. And one evening, as the stars Rose, she heard it again. The hum of a ship, faint at first but growing louder. She froze the child sleeping lightly beside her while the man stood outside scanning the horizon. They came quickly this time, no fewer than 5 soldiers leaping from the patrol craft with rifles drawn, their voices carried across the ruins, calling her name, commanding her to step forward. They promised again that if she returned, she would be spared, but the man would not. They promised her a place if she abandoned him and the child. The woman's heart twisted. She knew what it meant. They would use her as a tool, an example of how mercy could be given if one obeyed. She would live, but she would live as a shadow, forever branded, yet still breathing. The man turned to her, his eyes searching her face, and though he said nothing, she understood the question. He was ready to die fighting, but would she stand with him? She felt her knees weaken, and for a heartbeat she considered stepping forward. She could save herself. She could end the fear, the hunger, the waiting. But then she looked at the child. The little girl stirred in her sleep, a soft sound escaping her lips, and in that sound the woman felt something break inside her. She could not betray them, not after all they had given her when she had nothing. She could not return to a world that had thrown her away. When here in this fragile shelter, she had been seen not as barren, but as human. The soldiers grew impatient. One of them raised his weapon, and the man stepped in front of her, ready to shield her with his body. Her breath caught, and before she could think, she rushed forward. She shouted words in her language, words that meant no, words that carried all the anger she had held inside since her exile. The soldiers sneered, but they hesitated, and in that hesitation she struck. She had learned from the first fight how to move, how to use surprise. She seized a loose fragment of metal from the ground and swung it with all her strength, catching one soldier off guard. The man charged beside her, his blade flashing in the dim light, and the battle erupted again. It was chaos, the air filled with the roar of rifles and the clash of steel against armor. The woman fought with a desperation she had never known before. Her hands ached, her body screamed in pain, but she did not stop. Each strike was not only for her survival, but for the child who waited behind the stones. Each cry of defiance was for the life she had been denied, for the worth that had been stolen from her by those who now stood as her enemies. The man fought with equal fury, though his wounds slowed him. Still he did not falter. His determination burned brighter than any weapon, and his blade struck with the force of a man who had nothing left to lose. When the dust settled, 2 soldiers lay still on the ground, the others retreating back toward the ship. They shouted threats, promising to return again. With greater numbers, the engines roared, and soon the sky was silent once more. The man collapsed to his knees, his blade slipping from his hand. His body trembled with exhaustion, blood seeping from fresh wounds. The woman dropped beside him, her hands pressing against his injuries, her heart pounding with fear. He had risked everything again, and this time he might not survive. Child ran to them, tears streaming down her face, her small voice crying for her father. The woman pulled both of them close, her arms wrapping around them, as if her embrace alone could hold the world together. She whispered words of comfort, words she had once spoken to herself in the darkness after her exile. Now she spoke them for the child, and for the man. She would not let him die, not after all he had given, not after he had trusted her when she had not trusted herself. As the firelight flickered inside the shelter, she worked to stop the bleeding, her hands steady despite the fear clawing at her. She knew the soldiers would return, and next time they might come with more weapons and more anger. Yet she also knew her choice was made. She had stood against her people. She had fought for a man who did not see her as barren, and for a child who had called her family without hesitation. There was no going back that night. As the man lay weak beside the fire, the child sleeping against him, the woman sat awake, staring into the flames. She thought of the gates that had closed behind her, thought of the laughter that had followed her into exile, and she realized she no longer feared it. Her people could return with ships and soldiers, with chains and curses, but they could not take away what she had found in this fragile shelter. In fighting beside the man, she had become more than what they named her. She had become free, a new family, a new future. The dawn came slowly, painting the desert in soft shades of gold and silver. The woman sat by the fire, her eyes heavy from a night without sleep, while the man rested, weak but alive, beside her, and the child curled up between them, as though her small body was the bridge that held them together. The air was quiet, yet heavy with the memory of battle. The ruins still bore the marks of the struggle, broken stones, dark stains, and the silence of those who had fallen. She listened to the wind as it passed through the hollow spaces of the old structures, and she knew it carried more than dust. It carried the scent of danger still lingering in the air, for though they had survived, the soldiers would not stop. They had seen her. They had seen the man and the child, and they would return. The woman looked at the man, his face pale, his breathing slow but steady. She had bound his wounds with strips of cloth. She had fed him water with her own hands, and through the long hours of the night she had whispered to him words in her language, and in the little she had learned of his hoping, he would hear her through the haze of pain. He had fought for her not once, but twice, and now she would fight for him. She touched the child's hair gently, and the little one stirred, opening her eyes wide and innocent. The girl looked at her not with fear, but with trust, and she felt something she had never thought possible. She felt like a mother as the day stretched on. The man stirred more often. He tried to sit up, his body trembling with effort, but she pressed him gently back to rest. He gave her a faint smile, one that carried both gratitude and sorrow. His eyes told her what his words could not, that he feared for the child. If he could no longer protect her, she took his hand and held it tightly, promising with her silence that she would not let the girl be left alone. If he had given her life when she had been cast out, she would now give him her strength when he could not stand. The patrol ship did not return that day or the next. Perhaps they were gathering their strength. Perhaps they thought the desert itself would finish the work. But the woman knew the truth. If they stayed here, the soldiers would come again, and when they did, it would be the end. She made her choice with a heart both heavy and certain. They could no longer hide in ruins, waiting for death to arrive. They would have to leave this wasteland and find a place where the shadow of her people could not reach. She spoke to the man slowly, her words mixed between her own tongue and the fragments of his she had learned. She pointed to the horizon, to the mountains faint in the distance. She shaped her hands as though walking, and he understood. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded weakly, his eyes filled with doubt, for the journey would be hard, and his strength was failing. But when he looked at the child, his doubt gave way to resolve. He would go. He would not let his daughter die. In the desert, they prepared as best they could. The woman gathered food and water, though little remained. She strengthened the bindings on the man's wounds and fashioned a support for him to lean on. She carried what weight she could, though her body still bore its own scars. Together, they stepped out into the vast desert, with the child walking between them, her small hand in the woman's, the other in her father's. They left behind the ruins that had once been a fragile shelter, and entered a future unknown, yet filled with the spark of hope. The journey was long. The sun burned by day and the cold bit deep by night. The man stumbled often, but the woman held him up, her arm firm around his waist. The child never complained, though her feet grew sore, her face weary. She sang small sounds to herself, soft melodies that made the silence less heavy, and each time the woman heard them, she felt her strength renewed. The desert that had once been her tomb now became their path, their trial, their test. In the fourth night they reached the foot of the mountains. The air grew cooler, the land rougher, but in the distance they saw a faint light, not from the sky, but from fire. The woman's heart leapt, for where there was fire there was life. They approached carefully, wary of soldiers, but what they found was different. Hidden deep among the rocks was a small camp of human survivors like the man and the child. They looked rough and tired, but their faces softened when they saw him, and the child among them. There was joy in the reunion, for he had been thought lost in grief at the sight of his wounds. The woman stood back, uncertain, watching as they welcomed him, yet when their eyes turned to her there was no scorn. Instead they looked at her with caution, yes, but also curiosity, and when the child clung to her hand, refusing to let go, they seemed to understand. She was not an enemy, not to the girl, and not to the man. She was something more. She was family. Days passed in the safety of the camp. The man regained his strength slowly, though the scars would remain. The child laughed again, her voice carrying through the camp like music, and each time she did, the people smiled even in their hardship, and the woman, though still marked by the shame of her own people, found something she had never known. She found belonging. She was no longer barren. She was no longer condemned. She was a protector, a mother, a survivor. One evening, as the firelight glowed, she sat with the man and the child beside her. The stars spread wide across the sky, and for the first time she did not see them as cold and distant. She saw them as roads, as paths waiting to be walked. The man turned to her, his hand brushing against hers, not by chance, but by choice. His eyes carried gratitude deeper than words. He spoke softly, his voice steady, though still weary, and though she did not understand every word, she knew what he said. He was telling her she was not alone. The child rested her head against the woman's shoulder, her small hand wrapping around her arm, and whispered a single word in the human tongue, "Mother." The woman's heart trembled at the sound, and tears filled her eyes. She held the girl close, and in that moment, the chains of her old life broke completely. No law, no curse, no exile could take away the truth she had found here. She was not barren, she was not worthless, she was family, and as the fire burned and the stars watched silently from above, she knew that her story was no longer about shame or exile. It was about survival. It was about the courage of a lonely human father and the trust of a child, and the choice of a woman who had been left to die, but had chosen instead to live. The desert had taken everything from her, but in its harshness it had also given her something greater than she had ever imagined. It had given her a home, not of stone or law, but of love. And in that home she would remain, not as a condemned exile, but as a mother, a protector, and a survivor of a future that was only beginning. The end.